Hi, physiology peeps. Welcome to the last installment, the fourth lecture on Chapter 4, Part 2, Central Nervous System Physiology. So let's go ahead, share the screen, and we will finish this out. So last time, we had covered the meninges of the brain and blood flow to the brain, and very importantly, talked about why hematomas in the brain are very dangerous. So what we're going to start here with is coup-contracoup brain injuries. So coup-contracoup brain injury is a fancy name for a concussion. Most people have heard what a concussion is. Most people have not heard it. It's called coup-contracoup. Now, what happens with this is blunt force trauma to the head, which can happen if you get hit, if you fall, anything like that. So this image up here shows someone hitting someone with a bat. Well, any kind of fall causes the initial injury to the brain. That's the coup part of the impact. And what happens is that brain is held by some connective tissue inside a hard cranial case. The brain itself is very soft and tofu like in consistency. So, if you have an impact, that's the coup. The brain gets impacted with the first hit. And what will happen is the brain will bounce inside the brain case and energy will be passed to the back. Now, I can explain this, but I can also just show you the GIF. Here's someone who we don't know. They could have been in a car accident. They could have gotten whiplash, something like that. It could be a football player who just got tackled. And what happens is the first impact, the coup, is the brain hitting at the front. And then it bounces back and smacks the cranial case in the back. And every time that brain makes impact against that hard bone, you can have trauma to the brain. You can also have a bleed. And we covered last time the why hematoma in the brain is so dangerous. So that's what a coup-contracoup brain injury, blunt force to one part of the head, causes the brain to bounce. Okay, think about whiplash. You're in a car and you hit something, even if you're only going 30 miles an hour, your body and everything inside you is going at 30 miles an hour. And when you come to a sudden stop, brain inside your brain case goes like this, dunk, 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 until this energy is spent. Every time it makes impact against bone, you're going to have damage. Okay, so that's what a coup-contracoup brain injury is. It's a concussion. Okay, now let's move on. Since we're in the central nervous system, we've talked a lot about the brain. Let's talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord has different regions based on what vertebral bone the spinal cord passes through. So we have cervical vertebrae. We actually have 7 vertebral cervical bones, but we have 8 regions of the spinal cord going through there. The thoracic part of the spinal cord goes to the thoracic vertebral bones, and then we get 12 regions of that. The lumbar has 5 regions of the spinal cord, and the sacral has 5 regions of the spinal cord. Now, most people think the sacrum, I thought that was one bone. It is, but if you've looked at a sacral bone carefully, it's actually 5 bones that have fused together over evolution. Okay, so if we look at the image over here, I've color coded it. So the purplish, bluish purple color matches the cervical region of the spinal cord. If you look at the image, if someone has damage to their spinal cord in this region, you can predict based on where that region of the spinal cord is that was damaged, what kind of paralysis they might have. Okay, if you look here, injury to the spinal cord in the C4 region, that's up pretty high, can actually cause paralysis basically from the shoulders down. All right. Okay, so we're not going to memorize this. It's just an idea of the map of the spinal cord and where that information is going out to the body. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how white matter and gray matter is divided in the brain and spinal cord. Now, white matter is called white because those neurons in that neural tissue are myelinated. So I talked about myelinated neurons in the first lecture of this chapter, but myelinated neurons, information passes from one end of the neuron to the other end much, much faster with the myelin sheath on it. Compared to an unmyelinated neuron, it's going to be moving much slower. So myelin is all about the information highway, getting neurological impulses from point A to point B or C and D and F, and getting information through the spinal cord and then within the brain where it has to go. So Gray matter, on the other hand, is not myelinated, but they are neurons you find in cortexes of your brain, like the frontal lobe's motor cortex, like the parietal lobe's sensory cortex, like the occipital lobe's visual cortex, and so on. All right. Now, those neurons are pigmented, and that's why they're called gray matter. Okay. So, if we compare where gray matter and white matter is found in the brain versus the spinal cord, you'll find it's arranged differently. So let's look at an image of gray matter and white matter in the brain. So the white matter in the brain is more centrally located. Okay, now that's how information, think about wireless. Think about how information gets from one place to another. It gets from one place to another along tracks of white matter because of the myelin, and it gets there fast. So the central area of the brain is where white matter is found. The outer region, where all the cortexes are, this is the insula lobe right here, that's all gray matter. Okay. And then you have clusters of nuclei that are gray matter within the brain, like the amygdala, like the caudate nucleus, things like that. So that is going to look very different from the spinal cord, which actually information is the white matter is outwardly located. All right, all this white matter is to the exterior, and the gray matter is on the interior. In fact, the gray matter that's central in the spinal cord, they're called horns. Okay, because if you look at the back here, these things that go project back like horns, those are the dorsal horns, because that's the dorsal part of the spinal cord, and the ventral horns are, of course, found in the ventral region of the spinal cord. All right. What we're going to do next is talk about the different way information is traveling through the spinal cord, okay? Because there's a division of labor in the spinal cord. All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at how information is traveling through nerves in your body and then when it gets to the spinal cord. Now, most people in anatomy don't know this, but your nerves don't just stimulate muscles. They carry sensory information also up the spinal cord to the brain. So information is going in two directions. It's a bidirectional flow. So if we look here at the image that is supposed to show your skin, your integument, your skin can feel temperature, touch, pressure, vibration. All right, those are all sensory impulses. It's picked up by sensory receptors indicated by this green neuron. They're not really colored green, but that information goes in that nerve. It enters the spinal cord through the back, goes into the dorsal horn, and then that information is going to travel up the spinal cord to the brain, to an area where it gets interpreted. And we know from a previous lecture that should be the parietal lobe sensory cortex. So information's going up and forward to the brain. If it's a motor command coming from your brain, like your frontal lobe's motor cortex, that comes down the brain regions, down the spinal cord, and it leaves the spinal cord through the ventral root. Then that motor command goes out and merges with a common spinal nerve. See that image, the purple neuron here is delivering a motor command to muscles so that they'll contract. So motor commands descend the brain and spinal cord and leave the spinal cord on the ventral side. Sensory information ascends, comes into the spinal cord to the dorsal region of the spinal cord and ascends to an upper region of the brain to be interpreted. So information's always going either way. Okay. Now, looks like a complicated image, but really all you need to pay attention to is this is a sensory map of the entire body, where sensory perception is depending on what region of the spinal cord that information is going out. So in your cervical region, C1 through C8, it's hard to see, but it's color coded. It's basically sensory perception of the back of your head, tops of your neck and shoulders, and your dorsal and lateral arms. So lateral means the side, and dorsal means the back side of your arm. That's sensory perception for all those regions. Okay, so it's interesting to know that up in your cervical region of your spinal cord, you have sensory perception of your arms. Okay, moving to the thoracic spinal cord region. The dorsal part of the spinal cord is handling all that sensory information. So from T1 to T4, it is sensory perception of your anterior and your dorsal torso. All sensory perception for torso, front and back, is basically going to be perceived by that region of the spinal cord. Lumbar in blue, L1 through L5, is for your lower back or the lumbar region, and your front or anterior of your legs, sensory perception of those areas. Lastly, the sacral region of the dermatome provides sensory perception for the groin and the anus and the back or posterior of your legs. Okay, so this back part of the spinal cord, the dorsal part of the spinal cord, is your dermatome, and it's based on what cervical region are you in. Now, I talk about the dermatome not just to teach it, but also if someone has spinal cord damage, and let's say it is in the back part of the spinal cord within the thoracic region of that spinal cord. So you put someone to a scanner, they've been in a car accident, you send them to a CT scanner, and you find that there's damage to the back part of the spinal cord in this thoracic region. You would predict they might have a sensory deficit someplace on their torso, either the front or the back. And if you'd stick them with a pin, they might not feel that. Okay, so that's what the dermatome is. Now, since we're talking about the dermatome or the dorsal sensory part of the spinal cord, shingles is a painful condition that people who've been exposed to the chickenpox virus might develop as they age. Although we're finding a lot more younger people are coming up with shingles as well. So shingles is a painful skin rash or raised blisters, as this image on the lower right shows. And the important thing is it's painful. So it's not a pleasant thing to go through. Now, if you've been exposed to this chickenpox virus, for some reason, once you've gone through with the chickenpox and you've healed from it, that virus can lie dormant in your dermatome for a long period of time. And then sometime later, for whatever reason, if you're immunocompromised or stressed, you get a bout of shingles. Now, there's not much you can do for viruses until they've come up now with a shingles vaccine. Okay, so the shingles vaccine, here's the zoster vaccine. What this does is, if you know people in your family have had shingles or you've been exposed to chickenpox, that makes you possibly prone to getting it later on. If you get this vaccine, what it does is it decreases the chance that you're going to have shingles. And even if you end up getting it, like, having shingles, you'll have it maybe to a lesser extent, maybe a less painful extent. All right. So CDC recommends 2 doses spaced 2 to 6 months apart. So there's a shingles vaccine. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about, and you're not going to have to memorize all of this, it's just a concept. And the concept is this: information that's sensory goes up an ascending tract. So it's carried up the spinal cord, comes in the back of the spinal cord. So here we have a temperature receptor on someone's foot or a pain receptor on someone's hand. That information about that sense goes up the nerve, enters the spinal cord of the dorsal region, and then it ascends to the part of the brain where it's supposed to be interpreted. And if it's sensory, it's going to go to the sensory cortex of the parietal lobe. Okay? So it says here, information goes up to the brain. All right? It gets sorted at the thalamus. And the thalamus knows, oh, this is sensory information. I got to send that to the parietal lobe. Okay. Descending information, however, is a motor command from higher brain regions that descends the spinal cord. It goes out, leaves the spinal cord from the ventral horn, and goes to a muscle cell or a gland. And this one's showing a skeletal muscle that's going to receive the command to contract. Now, what is the importance of these for nurses? Well, you do common tests of people's spinal cord tracts and how information is getting through the spinal cord. A simple test that every nurse or doctor will do when a baby is born is called the Babinski reflex. Okay, so the Babinski reflex basically allows a nurse to determine in a normal infant, are their sensory ascending tracts working? Is that stimulus getting to the brain? And so what happens with the Babinski test is you're testing a cortical spinal tract. So you'll stroke the bottom of an infant's foot. And the normal response for an infant will be to flare their toes up like that. That's normal for a baby, okay? In an adult, if you do that same thing, they shouldn't flare their toes up. What will happen if you do it to an adult? They'll curl their toes down, okay? So a normal Babinski reflex for a baby, toes flare up. An abnormal Babinski reflex for a baby is if they curl their toes down. But if you've got an adult, the normal Babinski reflex is to curl their toes down. An abnormal response would be to flare their toes up. That means something's happening to the ascending tract. So let's click here for a little YouTube video on a baby in the Babinski reflex. Okay. See, stroke the foot, toes flare up. All right, that's normal for a baby. All right. Now, for an adult, here's their normal Babinski reflex. Stroke the foot, toes curl down. Ooh, that tickles. All right, that would be normal for an adult. It would be abnormal if those toes flared. See, that's abnormal. That should not happen in an adult, okay? All right, so really, that's the application of knowing the corticospinal tracts in a simple test that's done in a hospital every single day. Okay, thus endeth the chapter on central nervous system physiology. This is the fourth and final lecture. My next lecture will be on peripheral nervous system physiology.